various raw materials, chemists derive many different chemicals, which, when combined properly, will form plastics. Now, suppose you could look inside one of these chemicals. You would find that, like everything else, it is made up of billions of tiny particles called molecules. The qualities of the product, of course, determine the kind of resin that should be used. From the resin in which the molecules are in separate chains, a number of beautiful and useful things are made. It was indeed lucky for us that the men of plastics had labored so long and well, for suddenly we found ourselves at war. Faced with a critical metal shortage and unprecedented production demands, armament manufacturers immediately turned to plastics for assistance.
From the mid-1940s began what can be described as the legitimization period. And let's mention the elephant in the room immediately. Perhaps the most potent driving force for this period, with government investments in research projects, was precisely the prospect of a Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. But to the general public, a completely different argument was made. Open science was seen, especially in the West, as a vital confirmation of the superiority of democracy over despotism, and perhaps even as a protection against tyranny. Even for projects that were obviously linked to the military industry, a rhetoric was used that described these as opportunities for public benefit as well.
In transportation, plastics play a role of ever-increasing importance, lending their unique qualities to body construction and more of the mechanical parts. Certainly there will be more lightweight accessories, more handsome trim and interior refinements in tomorrow's cars, trains, and planes. The future will bring plastic fabrics wondrously fine, yet resistant to wear, wrinkles, and stains, even the hazards of washing. Shoes more glamorous than Cinderella's. But that's not all. There will be furniture combining strength with lightness, comfort with eye appeal. Homes throughout will be bright with color, economically but beautifully appointed, with many contributions of the kingdom of plastics designed for practical, gracious living.
In the Eastern Bloc, another general picture was painted, where certain niches of science were seen as spectacles of upper-class mannerisms. However, several governments in the East, such as the Soviet Union, in many cases secretly conducted the same type of research conducted in the United States. Thereof, in 1957, they beat the United States by being the first to send a satellite into orbit. Contrary to popular belief, researchers enjoyed a kind of protection regarding their research from despots like Stalin. He may have been a megalomaniac, but he too realized the potential fruits, especially in military contexts, that may come from giving researchers more freedom over their research. Science began to be seen as autonomous, and the ideal was for governments to extend the freedom of researchers as long as ethics or loyalty were maintained.
Scientists who are members of the Division of Chemical Physics work on projects which have complicated names. The papers they publish are full of elaborate mathematics. Most laymen would have trouble guessing whether their work was of any use or not, and not only the layman.
When I got the thing set up and it was giving the sort of results I expected, I was terribly excited. And I called in one or two of my colleagues and I said, look, that's atomic absorption. And they said, well, so what?
In 1952, the apparatus which left Dr. Walsh's colleagues so unimpressed seemed just an intricate scientific toy. Today, it has created an industry. Aim: to determine the amount of copper present in the sample. The result? Just over 1/2 part per million. Time of analysis? Less than 2 minutes. The technique is called atomic absorption spectroscopy, a technique which in the space of a few years has become one of the analytical chemist's most powerful tools.
We use atomic absorption analysis in the study of nutrition of plants and animals in a wide variety of experiments.
We use atomic absorption spectrophotometry in this hospital for measuring the amounts of elements which are normally present in very small amounts in the bodies of infants and children.
We used atomic absorption firstly in 1962 to test for iron and copper in wine.
We used atomic absorption for the determination of metallic impurities in plating solutions.
We are using it for the routine testing of diesel engine lubricating oils.
The period of professionalization began around the mid-1960s and saw an increase in influences from organizations such as the OECD and the RAND Corporation in scientific policy contexts. We also began to see an increase in exports of scientific policy methods to the Third World through UN agencies. It can be said that an internationalization began during the later part of the era. Governments began to gradually reduce spending on research and adopted the spirit that researchers should get more results with less resources. From the fact that research funding decreased but that the pool of researchers increased, this period saw an artificial increase in competition in science. Processes for peer review were formalized and began to have a de facto influence on how research funds were to be allocated. Basic research now see the beginning of depletion, as many researchers could more easily justify obtaining funding for specialization research, as results were more often achieved more quickly. The liability period can be said to have begun with the New Public Administration, NPM, which stands for New Public Management, in the early 1990s. These are a collection of reforms and projects in public sectors that seek to emulate private businesses to increase efficiency. In the middle of the decade, we also began to see a new concept being born: megascience.
On Sunday at 1800 hours, I learned that all my telephones were cut off. I had no further communication with the outside world. A delegation had flown out to me and asked to be received. This group of individuals, on behalf of the so-called Emergency Committee, proposed that I give up all my functions and transfer them to Ioannidis. That I had been overthrown.
And now, newsflash. Vice President of the USSR, Gennady Ioannidis, took office from Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev because Gorbachev is unable to perform his presidential duties for health reasons.
Mark the date well. August 19th, 1991. Historians are likely to be analyzing the events of this day for generations to come. Military leaders and the Soviet secret police have taken control of the government, and now Vice President Gennady Ioannidis is sitting in the president's seat.
Contact with Gorbachev, but an aide to Yeltsin said he believes the reports that Gorbachev is under arrest at the Black Sea. Ted?
The Soviet Union had collapsed, and the world was no longer a political dichotomy. Now perhaps an even deeper internationalization could take place. And with the results in hand, it can be said that it succeeded. The OECD was the body that coined the term megascience and refers to nationally comprehensive research that requires structural and academic support that individual institutes have difficulty offering. In many ways, the legitimization process from previous decades were neglected. Researchers could still enjoy freedom from governments, but their reasonable financial security was gone. On top of this, they were now expected to work closely with researchers, not only in other institutions, but often in other countries, at the same time as they were in full competition with them for disappearing resources. The fruits of the latest period, starting in the 90s, can be seen now in the research world, and it's not a pretty sight. I would argue that this hyper-competition in science that has been promoted ever since the 1990s, but to be honest, even before then, has led to a situation that is not sustainable in the research world. The whole point of science to discover things, whether it is through a competitive method or through teamwork, has been lost. The ego has gotten more room than the actual discovery, and that, in my opinion, is just not acceptable. And as it turns out, it's not just my opinion, but it's actually supported by actual findings of the research world. Reading from a paper from 2015 called Competitive Science, Is Competition Ruining Science? I quote the abstract. Science has always been a competitive undertaking. Despite recognition of the benefits of cooperation and team science, reduced availability of funding and jobs has made science more competitive than ever. Here we consider the benefits of competing in providing incentives to scientists and the adverse effects of competition on resource sharing, research integrity, and creativity. The history of science shows that transformative discoveries often occur in the absence of competition, which only emerges once fields are established and goals are defined. Measures to encourage collaboration and ameliorate competition in the scientific enterprise are discussed. Reading from later on in the study, a vivid real-world example of the costs of naked competition recently arose when a prominent senior scientist discouraged a younger researcher from joining the faculty at his institution. The young researcher received an email stating that the problem was that their research interests were too similar. I have a strong reservation about having you as a faculty colleague in the same building here at this time because of a serious overlap in research and approach. We briefly discussed the possibility of a collaboration, but this is complex. An additional drawback in logistics is about the shared resources and facilities. I, as director of the Institute, took the major role in securing and designing rodent holding, behavior, and transgenic facilities. I am afraid that accommodating your lab would be difficult. I am sorry, but I have to say to you that at present and under the present circumstances, I do not feel comfortable at all to have you here. Soon afterward, the younger scientist took another position, and an opportunity for two researchers with common interests to work together was lost. Perhaps the senior scientist merely wanted to avoid a duplication of effort. Nevertheless, the episode had collateral costs. After an institutional committee found that the senior scientist had behaved inappropriately, he stepped down as the institute director. A relationship between competition for funding and scientific misconduct is increasingly recognized. Eric Pullman, a University of Vermont researcher who served 12 months in federal prison for falsifying data, attributed his actions in part to a system in which the most amount of grants basically determine one's self-worth. Many scientists have noted that the publish or perish culture of contemporary science can foster bias in the scientific literature. Ioannidis explicitly states that competition and conflicts of interests distort too many medical findings. Large surveys of scientific faculty in the United States have shown a significant association between pressure to obtain external funding and soft money salary support with questionable research practices and neglectful or careless behavior. In a recent Belgian survey, half of scientists agreed that the competitive scientific climate led them to publish more articles, and more than half felt that publication pressure is detrimental to the validity of the scientific literature and to their relationships with fellow researchers. I can also report that we actually have actual statistical data to show how bad the current climate is for the research culture. In a paper from this year called What Researchers Think About the Culture They Work In, it states the following key findings. 84% of researchers are proud to work in the research community, but only 29% feel secure pursuing a research career. 78% of researchers think that high levels of competition have created unkind and aggressive conditions. Nearly 2/3 of researchers, 61%, have witnessed bullying or harassment, and 43% have experienced it themselves. Just over half of researchers, 53%, have sought or have wanted to seek professional help for depression or anxiety. Creativity is one of the most commonly cited features of an ideal research culture, but 75% of researchers believe it's currently being stifled. 69% of researchers think that rigor of results is considered an important research outcome by their workplace. However, 1 in 5 junior researchers and students, 23%, have felt pressured by their supervisor to produce a particular result. Only 14% of researchers agree that current metrics have had a positive impact on research culture, and 43% believe that their workplace puts more value on metrics than on research quality. These numbers are shocking, and it really shows how the scientific discipline has fallen so far from its previous grace. Now look, I'm not saying that things were wonderful in the past for scientists. They were not. Previous decades have had their own challenges that are unique to their time periods for scientists. But I just find it ironic and deeply depressing how the whole point of the scientific method is to accumulate knowledge so you can avoid certain practices that leads to bad results. Yet that is not applied to the culture and the methodology of research in of itself. Isn't the very definition of insanity to keep trying the same thing and expecting a different result? Ever since the 1990s, but even before then, we've been trying the same dysfunctional methodology to achieve results with lesser costs and time. Researchers are not just robots with lab coats. They're human beings. They have their own motivations to engage with their science, and they have their own satisfactions regarding the research that they commit. But the human element is missing these days in this culture that puts a bigger emphasis on results rather than the process that is supposed to lead to the results. It seems to me like we're trying to put the carriage before the horse, and we don't realize that in order to achieve the results that we want, you have to have a sensible timescale in mind as well as funding that is secure. I don't think it's fair to expect of researchers today in this hyper-competitive and defunded sphere to perform as though they wouldn't have these arbitrary and artificial restrictions in mind. I'm also not saying that competition doesn't belong in science. I think it does. A little bit of competition is always good, but there is already a natural sense of competitiveness in the scientific method as such. There is no need to artificially inflate the motivation of competition even further, and I think that this drive to make people hyper-competitive with one another when sometimes it makes more sense to just, collaborate to achieve a goal is creating an unhealthy environment for researchers. This is unacceptable, and I'm sure I'm not alone in thinking this. Now, I don't have all the answers at hand as to how we can fix current scientific approach and funding, but what I am saying is, researchers don't need bureaucrats to artificially inflate competitiveness and stress levels even further. Imagine you had a worker working in a store and their salary wasn't at all secure, and some months they may get their salary, but there could also be a month where they get none. Do you think that worker is going to do a good job? And more importantly, do you think that kind of work condition would be good for their mental health? Of course not. But when it comes to researchers, we somehow see them as robots that are supposed to be able to function at 100%, regardless of the circumstances, indefinitely. Now, what I'm about to say may sound pretentious, but I honestly believe this to be the case. There's an art to science. And in order to tap into the creative energies that science harbors to achieve the results you want, sometimes you have to accept that things take time. But anyway, thank you all for watching this essay in video form. I would also appreciate if you would subscribe as well as click the bell. Please also follow me on social media, preferably my Twitter, because that's where I post almost daily. The next essay is going to be about the tobacco companies versus the researchers of the 1940s to the 1970s. Take care, guys.